Here in Jamaica, I've done a lot of education with the people here on the time of day that they need to be out in the sun, because obviously it's hotter and not as pleasant in the middle of the day. And so if they're not a farmer or a fisherman, they have no need to be out in the sun in the heat of the day. And so we've done a lot of education with them, saying, it's going to take some time, even here in the tropics, for you to get enough vitamin D. And you need to be out there. Fortunately, here in Jamaica, it's like between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. There's a pretty big window of time that they can be out in the sun, but it's already hot at 8.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. And my paper, the original one, the basic review paper, I had a hard time getting them to assign my final peer reviewer. It was, the other peer reviewers finally approved it in the middle of August. And then I couldn't get a final peer reviewer to be assigned, and it just languished. And then as soon as I got that final peer reviewer assigned, the very next day she approved it, and it was ready to be published, I thought, because every other time I've published a paper, as soon as the peer reviewers give it a thumbs up, it goes straight to production for, any typographical errors and layout and that kind of thing. Instead, the editor came back to me and said, we have these content changes that we need you to make before your paper can be printed. And I was like, what? Aren't the peer reviewers the ones who are supposed to be the arbitrators of the content of the article? But no, they wanted me to remove every reference I had to people with melanin-rich skin. In other words, people who have a naturally darker toned skin having increased risk for vitamin D deficiency. And I said,
scientific fact.
Yeah, and I said that would be perfectly immoral if I knew that this was causing a certain group of people to be higher risk, and I refused to tell them because I wanted to be politically correct. No, I cannot do that. That's a deal breaker. I can rearrange the sentences, I can tone it down in other ways, but I can't just omit that fact. The peer reviewers accepted it with that information. I believe that information is critical to high risk individuals, and I won't remove it. And eventually they backed down, but it was a standoff there where my husband and I prayed over it, and we had made a conscious decision of are we going to, after all this work, allow this article to die on this hill? And we said, no, this is a hill I'll die on.
We had the number of stories of censorship. I mean, everybody's experienced censorship on social media and Twitter and now LinkedIn if they've tried to share things about vitamin D. I actually have a friend who works for Facebook, and who personally reversed some articles that I was sharing that got censored by Facebook. But that's fortunate that I know somebody there. But the second version of our causal inference paper was rejected by medRxiv, which is a preprint server, right? So preprints aren't supposed to judge content. They're supposed to, they have certain safeguards, which is fair enough. But the reason for rejecting the paper was that we'd added new use of quote causal language in a causal inference study. And they refused to publish it and said they wouldn't publish it unless we removed that wording and replaced it with phrases like is associated with, which is exactly the opposite of what we'd proven in the study.
Wait. So there must be something wrong with our Zoom call, because it sounded almost exactly like you said that there was censorship discussing vitamin D with respect to COVID?
And happening in preprint, not just, it also happens in journals. We've a colleague, you can use the word colleague, and an associate through this community, a few months ago shared, he'd had several, it's a well-respected professor of epidemiology and vitamin D expert, and he's had 3 rejections of a paper that he was a positive paper about vitamin D. 2 of the replies told him to change the finding to a negative finding, or they wouldn't publish the paper.
So
it's overt. It is overt.
But this is what I'm having such a hard time conveying to anybody who is only loosely paying attention to what's going on with our public health response to COVID, is that when somebody says that discussion of the effect of vitamin D and vitamin D deficiency on COVID is being censored on social media platforms, they've said something utterly remarkable. This is a very important factor in COVID. And I will ask you shortly to talk about an estimate of how much of the death that has flowed from COVID could have been prevented if people had been aware of the vitamin D issue and had dealt with it. But to the extent that vitamin D is extremely safe, extremely cheap, and apparently extremely effective at preventing COVID, when you are widely available, I mean, stacks of it at Costco, that are taller than I am. It's amazing what a simple, easily accessible intervention this is. And the fact that it even your story, Linda, about your being told to change language about populations having different susceptibility to deficiencies in vitamin D, who will be harmed by that? People who are likely to be vitamin D deficient who won't necessarily know about it unless someone has mentioned it. So even this is upside down. But
there is another group of people that will be harmed by that, because the narrative was that the reason why dark-complected people who were not living along the equator were having more hospitalizations, fatalities, and deaths from COVID-19 was because of health disparities. And that drove a huge influx of funds into public clinics and that sort of thing. That all of that funding was dependent upon the idea that we had now proven that health disparities were killing people. Now, I originally thought that might be the case until the UK Telegraph published their wall of heroes of the first people who had died of COVID-19, the first healthcare professionals who had died of COVID-19. The first 10 physicians to die of COVID-19 in the UK were all dark-complected people who were immigrants or their ancestors were immigrants to the UK. And just shortly after that wall started being published, it was up to 90% of all the people who died in the UK who were healthcare professionals, including or any health association at all, were dark complected. Now, you cannot tell me that a neurosurgeon who happens to be of Indian origin died of COVID because he couldn't get access to basic care. That is not why he died. It was not a health disparity issue.
Right. So this is, the problem is that the simple facts of the way information is being treated here, if you look at it and you acknowledge its implication, it makes you sound like a crazy person, right? We have an intervention. We can talk all day about repurposed drugs and whether they do or don't work and what the evidence says and whether randomized controlled trials are the answer or whether they're obscuring the answer. But this is vitamin D. And, I must say I've been using it as a bellwether. The very fact that we are still not recommending vitamin D to people in high latitudes who are almost certainly deficient, given the evidence, is an indicator that something that, to my mind, goes beyond anything that could be explained by incompetence is just very clear. And for you to encounter in the publication process that some sensitivity about interrupting some narrative about health disparities, which, as far as I'm concerned, probably do exist, but even figuring out to what extent they are explanatory requires a discussion of what other things might be leading to some portion of the disparity in outcomes that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So the idea that we know the conclusions and that we are going to dress them up as science and then provide them to the public, and in so doing, by the way, prevent people from having the information about vulnerabilities they themselves may harbor, right?
My African American friends and my Jamaican friends and my Ghanaian friends are angry that this censorship is occurring because they're saying, they are so yes, we all admit there are health disparities, but they are so focused on this narrative and on this end game that they have their political agenda that they are willing to risk the lives of me and my friends over their agenda. And that just makes me very angry.
And at the same time, I mean, I am just struck by the fact that we have Operation Warp Speed to produce vaccines at an incredibly rapid pace, an impressive feat. No matter what you think of the product that was produced, it is an impressive feat that they got there so quickly. But what have we done? We have sped the process of safety testing, which is something that cannot be accelerated. It's not a matter of something you can do faster, because in part what you're looking for are delayed effects. So what we've got is a system that pretends that it is so obsessed with your health that it is going to cut corners in your interest in order to get you to something that works as rapidly as possible. At the same time, it is ignoring something that clearly does work, that is clearly very safe and would be the number one intervention. I mean, in fact, my viewers will know that I have I think, well-founded obsession with the concept of diminishing returns. That this is the most important thing to understand with respect to complex adaptive systems, which is that there are some interventions that are highly effective and very easy, and then you exhaust those and you move towards things which do less and less at a greater and greater expense. And the point is, vitamin D is at the very most bargain level, right? The amount of good that could be done for the smallest amount of intervention is probably vitamin D. And yet somehow we're up here at some risky experiment that we're running with some very novel technology that is claimed to be safe, but obviously there are indications that it might not be so safe. In terms of efficacy, we know that 6 months down the road, it has spectacularly dropped off. So we're dealing with some super exotic remedy here when there's a very basic remedy that we're pretending doesn't exist. This makes no sense.
The level of financial commitment early on to vaccines was so high, and for the right reasons. At the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know what we were dealing with. It could have been something far worse than COVID-19. But once you've committed to a financial route that's worth trillions, who knows how much that's worth. Yeah, I think just the very idea that something as simple and cheap and widely available as vitamin D could be the solution would then lead to you having wasted all of that money and all of the operational setup. And I think at some level, whether it's cognitive bias, unconscious cognitive bias, or whether it's conscious, pernicious manipulation by the people who are making the trillions of dollars, or both, it's probably all of the things that we can think of. That just led to people not wanting to even try, because you've mentioned Pascal's wager before. Even if we were wrong, we knew we were wrong, but even if we were wrong, vitamin D is good for so many things. Why wouldn't you just, on the balance of risks, say, we know it's safe up to at least 4,000 international units. Actually, the studies show it's safe at higher than that, but
10,000 is
4,000.
There's no one who says that less than 10,000 is harmful. That 10,000 or less is harmful.
Right. And it's like, why wouldn't you just do that as a blanket recommendation to every adult, and then see if it works?
Yes, I've started to think about it this way, which is when one recommends an intervention, one has to think very carefully about the side effects. Right. And in this case, the side effects are largely positive, right? The side effects will be that people will be more resistant to other diseases. And so the point is, look, let's say somehow you two have completely misunderstood the evidence, right? I've read your work. I know that's not what happened, but let's say that somehow you had misunderstood the evidence about what was going on with the interaction of vitamin D deficiency and COVID. Then still the recommendation would be a slam dunk with respect to improving human health generally with a minimal safe intervention. Yeah. If you add on top of that the incredibly powerful evidence that this is an incredibly important factor in the harm that has come from COVID, and the point is, no rational person who was actually interested in controlling this disease and had looked at this evidence could possibly have failed to make this recommendation?
Well, I think there's something we're not taking into account. Obviously, people aren't rational, but there's something else we're not taking into account, and that is that most people like to perceive themselves as being intelligent heroes, and that's true of our public health officials as well. And basically, if they accept the vitamin D evidence that we've provided them now, they had been duped by previous things, and they're not heroes at all because they should have recommended this a year and a half ago. And so they'd be replacing their superhero's cape with a dunce cap. And no one wants to do that.
Well,
the hardest person to convince of something is the person who has been conned, basically.
Well, good. So let's hope they watch my podcast, because I think of myself as something of an expert at getting less dumb over time, right? And the key lesson here is that if you have been dumb and you're confronting the question of admitting that you've been dumb, it's still a bargain, because continuing to be dumb makes the cost go up. And getting smart as quick as possible is really, no matter how late in the process, no matter how, I mean, look, I've told you already. When COVID started, I would have told you, hey, you need to be a bit careful supplementing vitamin D because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, and that means there's a hazard of overdose. So we want to figure out exactly what that level is. You know what? That was dumb. That was an extrapolation from vitamin A, and it was not justified. And it presumably has had some effect on my thoughts about whether or not it would be a good idea to supplement vitamin D. Who knows how many respiratory viruses I have suffered from, or suffered worse than I might have, because I've been deficient in vitamin D for my whole life. But you know what? I'm not going to do that going forward.
Yeah,
and
but
so
you're a scientist, Bret, and we're scientists. I mean, Linda and I, we have many conversations where we've both said, I'll change my mind immediately. I currently believe this, but as soon as there's new evidence, I'll change my position. The three of us are scientists. That's what we do. We know we're trained to do that. But I don't think politicians, unless they're scientists, have that mindset, and they tend to double down.
Yeah, but you know what? You said something in passing a few minutes ago, which unfortunately fits the evidence all too well, which is that there's a perverse incentive here for many people.
There is. There's a perverse financial incentive. Absolutely.
There's a gigantic market that has opened up as a result of COVID. And if you imagine sociopaths or robots running the public health apparatus, and I'm not saying that that's what's going on, but just use that as a model for a moment. And you imagine that their purpose was to enhance their own position in the world, right? And that these markets were suddenly spitting out cash at an incredible rate, right? Well, then what would they think of repurposed drugs that work, like fluvoxamine or vitamin D, which is available, by the pallet full at your box store, right? What would they think if these things suddenly loomed up and threatened to control COVID and put the world back to normal?
Yeah, and as a result of that, we've actually had some vitamin D proponents who are offering a different message. There's a really nice, very elegant little study that was done, came out in December of 2020, but it didn't talk about COVID-19 at all, that looked at immunization's effects on the elderly and showed that if someone who's elderly, has very low vitamin D, and they're immunized, then when they look at their skin for antibodies, they find that they don't have a strong reaction to the vaccination, and they have a much better reaction to the vaccination if they have higher vitamin D levels. Then they took the people who had the poor reaction, supplemented them with vitamin D, and found that their reaction improved. And so even if you don't think vitamin D has anything directly to do with COVID-19, then you should at least be supporting, at this point, the public health people should at least be supporting vitamin D as an adjunct to the immunizations, because you're more likely to get a good response to that third or fourth or fifth booster if you have a higher vitamin D level.